Hi, I'm Jan with Jan's Jewelry Supplies. Welcome to our basic soldered pendant video. Today we're going to be making these two pieces, but I'm going to show you a few others before we get started on that. These three pieces are actually beads that have been wrapped in the copper foil and then soldered around. The only difference is this one I've actually attached jump rings, 3 jump rings at the bottom, and added a beaded chain, and then your jump ring at top. This piece right here is just a tumbled stone that I wrapped in the copper foil and soldered. This one here is actually 2 transparent stones that have a peacock feather that is sandwiched in between the 2 of them, and then I've just wrapped the tape around the 2 stones. These 2 pieces are just standard cabochons that have been wrapped in the copper tape and soldered. And one of the nice things about using the copper foil tape and solder is you can take just about any shape of stone or bead or even broken pieces and be able to use them. If you've got a really pretty stone but it's broken, you can wrap it. And this is one of my favorites. This one is actually a vintage stone that is an unusual shape, and I can't find any settings for them. Just ended up using the copper foil tape, soldering it, and then adding the leaf embellishment to the top. And the leaves came with a loop, so that is actually the loop for me to attach a jump ring and put it on a chain. These are the 2 pieces that we'll be doing. This is just a 19.5 millimeter transparent triangle stone that I've wrapped in the copper foil tape, and I used a 3 millimeter copper foil tape on this one and just added this little filigree. This is just a very large Navette stone. It's about 62 millimeters by 23 millimeters. Again, there's no stone or settings for this particular stone, so this was a nice way for me to be able to use this stone. I'm going to go over a few supplies that you will need. You may find other supplies that work for you. This is just what works for me. First thing you're going to need is a soldering iron. This one has a temperature control on it, and I believe it goes up to 450 degrees. I usually have it set at about 350. You will also need some solder. I use both of these. This is a solder wire with a rosin core. It melts at 300 degrees. I'm going to be using both of these. I'll use the wire on the first project. And these are just solder pellets. These do not have flux in them. I like to use these. We have a bunch of it in vintage stock, but I can no longer find it. But this is what I like to use. You will also need flux. And to keep my soldering iron clean, I keep a piece of steel wool and a damp cloth. You also need a brush, just to brush on the flux. And I find that having a third hand comes in handy. On the bigger pieces, I will use a clamp to hold on to the piece. Sometimes if they have a pointed back, it's hard to get the clamp to hold on to them, and you have to use pliers. And I have 2 different thicknesses of copper tape. I have a 5 millimeter and a 3 millimeter. For small projects, I use the 3mm, or for small pieces, I use the 3mm, and if they have a thicker edge, I will use the 5mm. With your soldering iron, when you store it, you need to store it with solder on it to keep it from oxidizing, and that's part of the reason why I keep the steel wool on there as well. It does start to oxidize while you're using it, so I keep it clean with the steel wool and the damp cloth. If you can see the difference in the edges of these two stones, this one is obviously a lot smaller, but it has also a much thinner edge. This one is a much larger stone, but it also has a thick edge. On this one, I'm going to be using the 3mm copper foil, since it does have such a thin edge and it's a very small piece. And to start out, I just take the copper foil and I cut it to where it's just a little bit larger than the piece that I'm working on. I want a little bit of overlap. Just peel the foil back, the foil tape back, and start placing it on the stone. I'm going to start just beyond the corner of the edge because I want to overlap that. And then I'm just going to start placing the tape around the edge of the stone. Just go all the way around the stone. When you overlap the tape, you want to try and make it even to where you can't see where one end begins and one end ends. So I'm overlapping that, and I'm going to take it on around the edge. I'm just going to cut it off. We go ahead and push the edges up against the stone. Once I have the tape pushed down on the stone, I will come back with just a hard piece of plastic, and this just happens to be a plastic knife. I just go around the edge and push the foil down to make it smooth before I start soldering it. I'll do this all the way around the edge and turn it over and do the same thing. I have foil all the way around the stone. Now I'm going to go in and add flux to the copper foil. I usually do a couple of sides at one time. Once I have flux on the tape, then I start adding my solder. I want to make sure my soldering iron is clean. Just wiping it on a cloth. I'm going to load my soldering iron up with a little bit of solder. And I'm just going to basically brush it along the edge of the foil. You want to make sure all of the copper is colored, is covered in silver. If you go to add solder to your iron and it will not stick to your iron, then just take your iron and wipe it on the steel wool a few times, and then wipe it on a damp rag, and that will clean off any of the oxidation, and the solder should stick to it again. I'm going to grab hold of the stone and add some flux. Then I'm going to load my iron with solder, and I'm just going to rake it across the stone or across the foil. The stone is completely covered in the silver. So now I want to add a filigree. I have a small filigree that I'm just going to curve so it kind of wraps around the stone a little bit. I want the coloring of this brass filigree to match the wire or the solder. So I am going to put some flux on it and basically color it with the foil or with the solder. Just going to put a little bit of solder on my soldering iron, and I'm going to start brushing the color onto the filigree. You're not going to be able to completely cover your filigree with solder, make it completely silver without having globs of silver and losing your detail of the filigree. I just want it to blend with the solder that's around the edge of the stone, so it will have a gold and silver look to it. I want to attach it to the stone. I'm just going to set it down and set the stone on top of it. Okay, I have the stone setting on top of the filigree. I don't know if you can see. I have it bent up to where it is touching the edge of the solder or the tape that is covered in solder. And at the very tip, I also bent it, curved it a little bit to where this loop, the bottom of this loop, is also touching the solder at this very point. I have found it's a whole lot easier to use a torch at this point. You might be able to successfully solder it, but it is a whole lot easier with a torch. So I am just going to get some solder, and this solder wire that I am using does have the solder that I'm using does have a rosin core, so I don't really need flux with this at this point. I'm going to go ahead and heat this area up and apply the solder. Here's the first finished piece. If you have problems with the stone moving when you add an embellishment or a jump ring, you can lay out some Play-Doh to lay the stone in, or use a J-board or even a wet floral board. To see how to do that, just view Soldering Made Easy video 1. In part 2, we'll be making this large pendant.